The sun scorched the dusty streets of Willow Creek as Fiona Flint scurried through the bustling market square. Her threadbare shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders despite the sweltering heat of the summer of 1879. Her once fine boots, now worn through at the soles, kicked up little clouds of dust with each hurried step as she approached Mr. Hollister's general store with dread knotting her stomach. "I need just one more week, Mr. Hollister," Fiona pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper as she stood before the stern-faced shopkeeper. The lines around her eyes had deepened in the 3 months since her father's passing, leaving her alone with a mountain of debt and a small homestead she could scarcely maintain. "Miss Flint, you've been saying one more week for the past month," Hollister replied, his mustache twitching with irritation. "Your father's debts won't pay themselves and my patience has run dry." "The crops will be ready soon," she insisted, though they both knew the small plot of land she tended alone would barely yield enough to feed herself, let alone pay what her father had borrowed. "Please, you need to pay what you owe." Hollister's voice rose, drawing the attention of other market-goers. $50 is what you owe me, Miss Flint, and I've been more than generous." Fiona felt heat rise to her cheeks as curious onlookers began to gather. Among them stood Barton Walsh, a cattle baron who'd been pressuring her to sell her land since her father's funeral. His smug expression told her he was enjoying her humiliation. "Look at her," Walsh said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Charles Flint's daughter reduced to begging, shameful." "I am not begging," Fiona responded, raising her chin despite the trembling in her hands. "I'm asking for a reasonable extension on a debt I fully intend to pay." Walsh stepped closer, his expensive boots gleaming in the harsh sunlight. "You know my offer for your land still stands, though I'm thinking it's worth less each day you let it go to ruin." "I'm not selling my father's land," Fiona said firmly, though hunger and exhaustion had worn her resolve thin. "Then perhaps you ought to find another way to pay your debts," Walsh sneered, his meaning clear in his leering gaze that traveled down her slender frame. Several onlookers chuckled, and Fiona's face burned with humiliation. She had come to town with the last of her mother's jewelry hidden in her pocket, hoping to sell it to the silversmith. But he had offered so little that she couldn't bear to part with the final reminder of her mother for such a pittance. "Mr. Hollister, please," Fiona tried again. "I'll bring you fresh vegetables from my garden tomorrow, and I can help in the store to work off the rest." "I don't need your wilted vegetables or your help," Hollister cut her off. "I need payment, Miss Flint, or I'll have the sheriff seize your property to cover your debts." "He can't do that," Fiona protested, though she wasn't entirely certain of the law. Walsh laughed outright. "Oh, but he can, and when he does, I'll be there to take that worthless plot off the county's hands for a fraction of what I offered you." Anger surged through Fiona, momentarily overcoming her fear. "My land is not worthless. The water rights alone, water rights," Walsh interrupted with a cruel laugh. "A woman like you has no business talking about water rights. You can barely keep yourself alive, let alone manage property." Before Fiona could respond, Walsh turned and spat on the ground at her feet, but a gust of wind carried the spittle upward, splattering across her cheek and the front of her dress. Shock froze her in place as laughter erupted around her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, refused to give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I believe the lady deserves an apology." The deep, unfamiliar voice cut through the laughter like a knife. The crowd parted as a tall figure stepped forward. Fiona had never seen him before she would have remembered. He stood over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a lean frame clothed in trail-worn but well-kept attire. A weathered Stetson sat atop dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt, and his face, though tanned and lined from sun exposure, couldn't have belonged to a man much past 30. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Walsh said, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol at his hip. The man's eyes, a striking shade of green, remained fixed on Walsh, but he made no move toward his own weapon. Instead, he pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and stepped toward Fiona. With a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance, he offered it to her. "May I?" he asked quietly. Stunned, Fiona nodded. The stranger carefully wiped the spittle from her cheek, his touch light and respectful. "The name's Dawson Porter," he said, his voice meant only for her ears. "And it seems to me a lady shouldn't be treated this way in a civilized town." "Thank you," Fiona whispered, mortified yet grateful. Dawson turned back to face Walsh and Hollister, standing slightly in front of Fiona now. "How much does the lady owe you, shopkeeper?" Hollister blinked in surprise. $50, but without hesitation, Dawson reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He counted out several gold coins and placed them on the counter. $50 paid in full. I believe that settles, Miss Flint, Fiona supplied, her voice faint with disbelief. Fiona Flint. Miss Flint's account, Dawson finished, fixing Hollister with a steady gaze. "I trust you'll provide a receipt." Hollister's eyes widened at the sight of the gold coins. He quickly scooped them up and nodded. Of course, just a moment, sir." Walsh's face had reddened with anger. "You're sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, mister." "Do you have any idea who I am?" "A man who spits on women," Dawson replied evenly. "That tells me all I need to know." Several onlookers gasped at his boldness. Barton Walsh was not a man to be crossed in Willow Creek. His cattle operation employed half the men in the county, and his influence with the local authorities was well known. Walsh's hand twitched closer to his gun. "You'll regret this intervention, stranger." "Perhaps," Dawson said with a slight shrug. "But not nearly as much as you'll regret drawing that weapon in broad daylight with the sheriff watching from across the street." Walsh's eyes darted to where Sheriff Miller indeed stood observing the confrontation from outside the jailhouse. The cattle baron's jaw tightened, but he slowly moved his hand away from his pistol. "This isn't over," Walsh muttered before turning on his heel and stalking away, his supporters trailing behind him. Hollister returned with a receipt which he handed to Dawson with noticeably more respect than he'd shown Fiona. "Your receipt, sir. The lady's debt is cleared." Dawson passed the paper to Fiona, who stared at it in bewilderment. "Mr. Porter, I cannot accept this." "It's too much. I don't even know you." "Consider it a loan, then," he said quietly. "One with considerably better terms than you've been getting here." The crowd began to disperse now that the excitement had ended. Fiona stood clutching the receipt, her mind racing with questions about this stranger who had appeared from nowhere to rescue her. "May I escort you somewhere safer to talk, Miss Flint?" Dawson asked. "I believe we have some arrangements to discuss." Fiona hesitated only briefly before nodding. "My wagon is at the edge of town. We could talk there." They walked in silence through the market, Fiona acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk. Her ancient wagon with its single aging mare looked particularly shabby next to the confident stride of the man beside her. "Why did you help me?" Fiona finally asked when they reached the relative privacy of her wagon. Dawson removed his hat, revealing a full head of dark hair with a few strands of silver at the temples. "I've never been one to stand by when someone's being mistreated, especially not a lady alone." "That's very gallant," Fiona said, "but $50 is a substantial sum. I'm not sure when I'll be able to repay you." "I'm not concerned about that at the moment," Dawson replied, "though I am curious about your situation if you don't mind sharing it." Fiona sighed, suddenly weary to her bones. "My father died 3 months ago. He left me our homestead, but also considerable debts. I've been trying to manage on my own, but—" She gestured helplessly at her worn clothing and tired horse. "And this Walsh fellow wants your land." "Yes." "He's offered to buy it, but at a fraction of its worth. The property has good water access, which makes it valuable, especially to someone with cattle." Dawson nodded thoughtfully. "I know the type. Men like Walsh see something they want and believe they're entitled to take it one way or another." "Exactly," Fiona agreed, surprised by his understanding. "But I can't sell. That land is all I have left of my family. My mother is buried there and my father too now. What about other family, siblings, aunts or uncles who might help?" Fiona shook her head. "No one, it's just me." Dawson was silent for a moment, considering. "Miss Flint, I've just arrived in these parts looking for work and a place to settle. I've been riding with cattle drives for years, but I'm getting too old for that life." He offered a self-deprecating smile. "I have some savings and experience with ranching. Perhaps we could come to an arrangement that would benefit us both." "What sort of arrangement?" Fiona asked cautiously. "I need a place to stay and you need help with your land. I could work your property, help get it productive again. We could split whatever profits come, and I'll consider my $50 an investment rather than a loan." Fiona stared at him. "You want to be my partner? You don't even know if my land is worth anything." "I'm a good judge of character, Miss Flint, and you strike me as someone who wouldn't fight so hard for something without value." His eyes met hers directly. "Besides, I've had my fill of drifting. A stake in a modest homestead sounds appealing right about now." "This is very sudden," Fiona said, her mind whirling with possibilities. With help, the farm could indeed become productive again, yet she barely knew this man. "How do I know I can trust you?" Dawson's expression grew serious. "You don't. Just as I don't know if your land is worth my investment." "We'd both be taking a chance," he gestured toward the town. "But it seems to me your options are limited at present." He was right about that. Fiona had been on the verge of losing everything just minutes ago. And there was something in Dawson Porter's steady gaze that inspired trust despite her natural caution. "I have a small cabin on the property," she said slowly. "It was built for a farmhand, though we haven't had one in years. You could stay there while we see if this arrangement might work." Relief flickered across Dawson's face. "That sounds fair. I have my horse and gear at the livery. If you're ready to return home, I can collect my things and follow." "You're eager to start," Fiona observed, a hint of suspicion returning. "Miss Flint, I've spent 15 years following cattle across 4 states. The prospect of sleeping in the same bed for more than 2 nights running is incentive enough." He smiled, and Fiona was struck by how it transformed his weathered features, revealing laugh lines around his eyes and a small dimple in his right cheek. "Very well, Mr. Porter. I'll wait while you gather your belongings." As Dawson strode off toward the livery, Fiona took a deep breath, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake or possibly the first good decision since her father's death. Either way, she had just invited a stranger to live on her property. A man who had appeared like some hero from a dime novel just when she needed him most. The late afternoon sun was already casting long shadows by the time they arrived at the Flint homestead, a modest property nestled in a small valley with a creek running along its eastern edge. The main house was a simple 2-story wooden structure, weathered but solid. Nearby stood a barn, a chicken coop, and the small cabin Fiona had mentioned. Dawson took in the property with an appraising eye as they approached. Despite clear signs of neglect, a sagging fence, overgrown fields, peeling paint, he could see the potential immediately. The soil looked rich, the water source reliable, and the layout practical. "Your father chose good land," he commented as Fiona reined her wagon to a stop before the house. "He built everything himself," she said with obvious pride. "Came out here with nothing but a wagon full of tools and seeds 25 years ago." Dawson dismounted and helped Fiona down from her wagon, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "You grew up here then, born in that very house," she confirmed, nodding toward the structure. "Never lived anywhere else." "That explains why you're so determined to keep it," Dawson said softly. Fiona led him to the small cabin, which stood about 50 yards from the main house. It was a simple 1-room structure with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. Inside was sparse but clean, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, a chest for clothing, and a small cookstove. "It's not much," Fiona apologized, suddenly seeing the humble space through a stranger's eyes. "It's perfect," Dawson assured her, setting his saddlebags on the table. "Best accommodations I've had in months. The well is between the houses," Fiona explained, "and there's an outhouse behind the cabin. I usually take supper at 6 if you'd care to join me. We can discuss our arrangement further then." Dawson nodded. "Thank you, Miss Flint. I'll get settled and see to my horse." As Fiona walked back to her house, she felt Dawson's eyes on her back. A shiver that had nothing to do with fear ran through her. It had been a long time since a man had looked at her that way with respect and perhaps a touch of admiration. She pushed the thought aside. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. Dawson watched her go, struck by the quiet dignity she maintained despite her circumstances. Most women in her position would have sold to Walsh long ago and moved to town or sought a hasty marriage. Her determination intrigued him almost as much as her delicate features and the spark of intelligence in her blue eyes. He unpacked his few possessions, then tended to his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Caesar. As he worked, Dawson surveyed the property more carefully. The land had good bones, as his father would have said, but it needed considerable work. The fences required mending, the fields clearing, and the barn looked like it might need structural repairs before winter. By the time 6 o'clock approached, Dawson had formed a mental list of priorities for the coming days. He washed up at the well, combed his hair, and changed into a clean shirt before knocking on the main house door. Fiona answered wearing a simple blue dress that matched her eyes. Her hair, which had been tightly pinned under a bonnet in town, now hung in a thick braid over one shoulder. Without the strain of public humiliation, her face appeared younger, softer. "Mr. Porter," she greeted him. "Please come in." The interior of the house was modest but well-maintained, with handmade furniture and simple curtains. A few touches of patchwork quilt, a shelf of books, dried flowers in a jar hinted at the home it had been before grief and poverty had taken their toll. "Something smells wonderful," Dawson commented as he followed her to the kitchen. "Just rabbit stew," Fiona replied, though she looked pleased at the compliment, "and some cornbread. I'm afraid it's not much." "Home-cooked food is a luxury for a man who's been on the trail as long as I have," he assured her. They sat at the kitchen table, and after a brief, awkward moment when Fiona bowed her head for a silent prayer, they began to eat. The stew was simple but flavorful, the cornbread light and crumbly. "This is excellent," Dawson said sincerely after his first few bites. "Thank you." Fiona studied him across the table. "Mr. Porter, I realize I've invited you into my home knowing very little about you." Dawson set down his spoon. "That's fair. What would you like to know?" "Where are you from originally? You don't sound like you're from the West." "Virginia, originally," he replied. "My family had a small farm there before the war. I lost my parents and brother in the fighting, though I was too young to serve myself." "I'm sorry," Fiona said softly. Dawson nodded his acknowledgement. "Afterward, there wasn't much left for me there. I headed west like so many others, worked odd jobs until I found myself on a cattle drive. Been doing that ever since, mostly up to Montana and back. And now you want to settle down. Why here?" "I'm 34 years old, Miss Flint. Trail life is for younger men. As for why here," he shrugged. "I like the look of this country. Good water, good grass, room to breathe." Fiona considered this. "And have you had experience with farming? This isn't ranch land, Mr. Porter." "My family grew tobacco and some corn back in Virginia. I'm no expert, but I know soil and seasons. I can learn the rest." He leaned forward slightly. "And I'm strong, Miss Flint, not afraid of hard work. Whatever this land needs, I can provide it." The intensity of his gaze made Fiona look away, her cheeks warming. "Very well. Let's discuss terms then." They spent the next hour outlining their arrangement. Dawson would live in the cabin, work the land, and make necessary repairs. They would share expenses and profits equally. He would advance additional funds as needed for seed and equipment, keeping a careful accounting that would be settled when the farm began to produce again. "There's one more thing," Fiona said hesitantly as they concluded their discussion. "My reputation in town is already compromised by my circumstances. Having a single man living on my property will only make matters worse." "I understand your concern," Dawson replied. "Would it help if we made it known that I'm employed as your farmhand rather than a partner, at least until we see if this arrangement works out?" "Yes, that would be better," Fiona agreed, relieved he understood without her having to explain further. "Though I'm not sure how much it will matter. Barton Walsh has considerable influence in these parts, and after today's confrontation, he's unlikely to make things easy for either of us." Dawson's expression hardened slightly. Men like Walsh only understand one thing's strength. Once he sees we're serious about making this place work, he'll back down. I hope you're right, Fiona said, though she sounded unconvinced. They settled into a routine over the following days. Dawson rose before dawn to tend to the animals and begin the day's work. Fiona managed the house, the garden, and the chickens while assisting with whatever larger projects Dawson undertook. They took meals together, Dawson insisting on contributing to the provisions from his own supplies. On the third day, while repairing the chicken coop, Dawson asked, "Do you mind if I ride into town tomorrow for supplies? We need nails, wire for the fences, and seed if we're going to plant anything this season." "Of course," Fiona replied, holding a board steady for him. "Though perhaps I should come along. People might talk less if we're seen together rather than you going alone on my behalf." Dawson considered this. "You might be right. Besides, you'll know better what we need for the house." The following morning, they set out for town together, Fiona in her wagon and Dawson on horseback beside her. As they approached Willow Creek, Fiona grew noticeably tense. "I haven't been back since that day," she admitted. "I'm not looking forward to facing those people again." "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Dawson said firmly. "Hold your head high, Miss Flint. You're a landowner conducting business, same as anyone else in this town." His confidence buoyed her, and Fiona sat straighter as they entered the main street. They visited the lumberyard first, where Dawson ordered materials for repairing the barn and fences. The proprietor was coolly polite, clearly having heard about the confrontation with Walsh. At the general store, Hollister's manner was stiff but correct as they selected supplies. Several customers watched them with undisguised curiosity. Fiona forced herself to ignore their stares, focusing instead on selecting the items they needed. "Miss Flint," a female voice called as they were loading their purchases into the wagon. Fiona turned to see Mrs. Bennett, the minister's wife, approaching. "I heard you had assistance with your troubles. I'm glad to see you're well." "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett," Fiona replied, uncertain of the woman's intentions. "May I introduce Mr. Dawson Porter? He's working as my farmhand." "A pleasure, madam," Dawson said, tipping his hat. Mrs. Bennett assessed him with sharp eyes. "You're new to our community, Mr. Porter. Where do you hail from?" "Most recently, Montana Territory," he answered smoothly, "but I'm looking to put down roots here." "I see, Mrs." Bennett's tone suggested she saw more than was being said. "Well, Miss Flint, perhaps we'll see you at services on Sunday. It's been some time since you attended." Fiona flushed. "I've been preoccupied with the farm, but yes, perhaps I will come, after Mrs. Bennett departed. Fiona sighed heavily. "That will be all over town by sundown." "Is that so bad?" Dawson asked. "Better they think you have legitimate help than imagine you struggling alone." "I suppose you're right." They had just finished loading their supplies when a familiar figure emerged from the saloon across the street. Barton Walsh, accompanied by two of his men, spotted them immediately. His face darkened as he strode toward them. "Well, well," Walsh called, loud enough for bystanders to hear. "If it isn't Miss Flint and her mysterious benefactor, getting cozy out there on your little farm," Dawson positioned himself slightly in front of Fiona. "Mr. Walsh, I had hoped our previous meeting made it clear that Miss Flint is not to be harassed." Walsh's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just making friendly conversation. Folks around here are mighty curious about a man who pays other people's debts so readily." He looked past Dawson to Fiona. "I wonder what services he's getting in return." Fiona gasped at the implication. Dawson's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice even. "Mr. Walsh, I understand you're used to intimidating people to get what you want. That won't work with us. Miss Flint's land is not for sale, and your insinuations about her character only diminish your own." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the prospect of another confrontation. Walsh was clearly aware of his audience. "Big words from a drifter," Walsh sneered. "How long will you stick around once you realize that worthless plot can't support two people? Or maybe that's not why you're staying." His gaze slid to Fiona again, his meaning unmistakable. Before Dawson could respond, Fiona stepped forward. "Mr. Walsh, your interest in my affairs is puzzling considering you have a ranch to manage. Perhaps if you focused more on your own business and less on mine, Your cattle wouldn't be straying onto the Peterson property as they were yesterday." Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Walsh's cattle trespassing was a sore point with several local farmers who had complained of damaged crops. Walsh's face reddened. "You'd best watch yourself, Miss Flint. Accidents happen to people who don't know their place." "Is that a threat, Mr. Walsh?" Sheriff Miller's voice cut through the tension as he approached from the direction of his office, because it sounded remarkably like one to me. Walsh forced a laugh. "Just a friendly warning, Sheriff. These hills can be dangerous for the unprepared." The sheriff replied skeptically. "Miss Flint, Mr. Porter, are you folks finished with your business in town?" "Yes, Sheriff, we were just leaving," Fiona answered, grateful for the intervention. "Then I suggest you be on your way, and Walsh, I suggest you remember that threats of any kind are taken seriously in my jurisdiction." Walsh's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. "No threats, Sheriff. Just neighborly advice." Dawson helped Fiona into her wagon, his hand lingering supportively on her arm for a moment. As they pulled away from the general store, Fiona let out a shaky breath. "That man frightens me," she admitted quietly. "He has reason to be desperate," Dawson replied thoughtfully. "If what I've heard in town is correct, Walsh's operation depends on access to water that your land controls. Without it, his expansion plans are worthless. That doesn't give him the right to intimidate me." "No, it doesn't," Dawson agreed grimly, "but it does mean he's unlikely to give up easily." They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. Finally, Fiona spoke. "Thank you for standing by me in there. Few people in town would dare cross Walsh like that." "You stood up for yourself pretty admirably," Dawson pointed out with a small smile. That comment about his stray cattle was inspired. Fiona couldn't help but smile back. "It just came to me. I've heard the Petersons complaining about it for weeks." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of shared triumph, perhaps, or the beginning of deeper understanding. Fiona looked away first, suddenly conscious of how her perception of Dawson had shifted in just a few days. No longer simply a mysterious benefactor, he had become someone she was beginning to trust, perhaps even rely upon. The weeks that followed were filled with hard work and gradual progress. Dawson repaired fences, cleared fields, and prepared the soil for planting. Fiona expanded her vegetable garden and began selling eggs and butter to neighbors again. Together, they cleaned and repaired the barn, making it sound for the coming winter. True to his word, Dawson kept meticulous accounts of their expenses and projected income. Each evening, they would sit at the kitchen table, heads bent over the ledger, planning the farm's revival. Sometimes their conversations would extend beyond business, sharing stories of their pasts or discussing books from Fiona's small collection. Dawson spoke of his travels, painting vivid pictures of mountain ranges and prairie expanses that Fiona, who had never ventured more than 20 miles from her birthplace, could only imagine. In turn, she shared memories of her parents and the farm in better days, stories that had remained locked inside her since their passing. "My mother used to say that land has a memory," Fiona told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "That it remembers the people who care for it and rewards their devotion." "Wise woman," Dawson commented. "My father said something similar, that you don't really own land, you're just its caretaker for a while." "Do you miss Virginia?" Fiona asked, studying his profile in the fading light. Dawson considered the question. "I miss what it was before the war, but that place doesn't exist anymore." He turned to meet her gaze. "What about you? Have you never wanted to see more of the world beyond Willow Creek?" "Sometimes," Fiona admitted. "When I was younger, I dreamed of going to San Francisco or even back east. But then Mother got sick and Father needed help with the farm." She shrugged. "Dreams change, I suppose." "They don't have to die," Dawson said softly. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Fiona felt her heart quicken as Dawson's gaze lingered on her face. For a moment, she thought he might reach for her hand, but instead he cleared his throat and stood. "It's getting late. We have an early start tomorrow if we want to finish planting the north field." "Yes, of course," Fiona replied, uncertain whether she felt relief or disappointment. As promised, Fiona began attending Sunday services again, now with Dawson at her side. Their regular appearance in town together sparked inevitable gossip, but Fiona found she minded less than expected. There was something fortifying about having Dawson beside her, his quiet confidence seeming to shield her from the worst of the speculation. Some in the community began to warm to them, particularly after Dawson helped the blacksmith extinguish a fire that had threatened to spread to neighboring buildings. Sheriff Miller, too, showed increasing friendliness, stopping by the farm occasionally to check on their progress. "You two are making quite a difference out here," he commented during one such visit. "Place is starting to look like it did when Charles was in his prime." "We still have a long way to go," Fiona said, but pride colored her voice. "Walsh giving you any trouble?" The sheriff asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Dawson and Fiona exchanged glances. There had been no direct confrontations, but twice they had found fence posts pulled up along the property line adjacent to Walsh's land, and once a section of irrigation ditch had been mysteriously damaged overnight. "Nothing we can prove," Dawson answered carefully. The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "Well, just so you know, Walsh's influence isn't what it used to be. That business with the stray cattle has more folks riled up than you might think, and there's talk his eastern investors aren't happy with delays in his expansion plans." After the sheriff departed, Dawson found Fiona in the garden, harvesting late summer vegetables. The August sun had kissed her skin to a golden hue, and working outdoors had added strength to her slender frame. She looked up as he approached, wiping perspiration from her brow with the back of her hand. "Sheriff had some interesting things to say about Walsh," Dawson remarked, kneeling to help her with the harvesting. "Yes," Fiona agreed, "though I'm not sure it makes me feel any safer." A desperate Walsh might be even more dangerous than a confident one. Dawson's hand covered hers briefly. "We'll be careful, and we're making good progress. By spring, we should have enough income to hire additional help. You really believe we can make this work, don't you?" Fiona asked, studying his face. "I do," Dawson replied simply. "Don't you?" Fiona looked around at the farm, at the repaired fences, the freshly painted barn, the flourishing fields. In just a few months, the property had begun to resemble the home she remembered from childhood. And at the center of this transformation stood the man beside her, whose arrival had seemed providential. "Yes," she said softly, "I believe we can." That night, a violent thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. Fiona woke to the crash of thunder and the sound of rain hammering against the roof. Lightning illuminated her bedroom in brief, brilliant flashes as she pulled on a robe and lit a lamp. A particularly loud crack was followed by a sound of splintering wood. Fiona rushed to the window and gasped. Lightning had struck one of the tall pines near the barn, and it had fallen partially onto the roof. In the intermittent flashes, she could see that the damage was significant. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and raced downstairs and out into the rain. The wind whipped her nightgown around her legs as she ran toward the barn, worried about the horse and milk cow sheltered inside. "Fiona," Dawson's voice carried over the storm as he emerged from his cabin, a slicker hastily thrown over his clothes. "Get back to the house, the animals." She called back, already reaching for the barn door. Together, they managed to lead the frightened animals out and secure them in a sheltered paddock. By then, both were drenched to the skin, and Fiona was shivering violently. "We need to get you warm," Dawson said, his arm around her shoulders as they hurried back toward the main house. Inside, Fiona's teeth were chattering too hard for her to protest as Dawson stoked the fire to a blaze and wrapped a quilt around her shoulders. He disappeared briefly, returning with a bottle of whiskey from his cabin. "Medicinal purposes," he explained, pouring a small amount into a cup and adding hot water from the kettle. "Drink this, it will help." The fiery liquid spread warmth through Fiona's chest. Gradually, her shivering subsided, though her wet hair still clung to her face and neck. Dawson, she noticed, looked no better, his own clothes soaked through. "You need to change too," she said, suddenly aware of their situation alone in her house in the middle of the night, both of them in various states of undress. Propriety demanded she send him back to his cabin, but the storm still raged outside. I think some of my father's clothes are still in the chest upstairs. They might fit you. Dawson hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against practicality. If you're sure it wouldn't be inappropriate. It would be more inappropriate to let you catch your death of cold, Fiona replied with forced lightness. The clothes are in the first bedroom at the top of the stairs. I'll change in my room. When she returned downstairs in dry nightclothes and a thick robe, her hair wrapped in a towel, Dawson was standing by the fire in her father's old flannel shirt and trousers, both slightly too short, but otherwise a reasonable fit. He had draped their wet clothes near the hearth to dry. "The rain's letting up," he said as she entered. "I should return to my cabin soon." "Thank you for coming to help," Fiona said, suddenly shy in his presence. "I wasn't thinking clearly when I ran out like that. The animals would have been frightened," Dawson acknowledged. "I would have done the same." They stood facing each other in the firelight, the storm's intensity diminishing around them while a different kind of tension built in the room. Dawson's hair, usually neatly combed, fell across his forehead in damp waves, making him look younger, more vulnerable somehow. "Fiona," he began, her name soft on his lips. It was the first time he had used it instead of the formal Miss Flint, and the intimacy of it made her breath catch. "These past months working alongside you, I've come to admire you greatly." "I admire you too," she whispered, her heart pounding. "You've brought this farm back to life." "No, we have," he corrected gently. "Together." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. "I came here looking for a place to settle, but I've found something I wasn't expecting." "What's that?" Fiona asked, though she thought she knew the answer, could see it in the way he was looking at her. "A partner," Dawson said. "Someone I want to build a future with, not just a farm." He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and took her hand in his. "I'm falling in love with you, Fiona Flint. I think I have been since that day in town when you stood your ground despite everything." Fiona's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of a happiness she had not expected to feel again after losing her parents. "I thought I was alone in these feelings," she admitted. "That perhaps I was imagining the way things were changing between us." "Not imagining," Dawson assured her, his thumb caressing the back of her hand. "Very real, but I didn't want to presume, didn't want you to think I had ulterior motives when I offered to help with the farm." "I know you better than that now," Fiona said softly. She stepped closer, drawn by the warmth in his eyes. "I love you too, Dawson. I think I started falling that day you wiped my face in the market and stood up for me when no one else would." Dawson's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as it had been that first day. "May I kiss you, Fiona?" Her answer was to rise on her tiptoes and press her lips to his. The kiss was tender at first, a sweet exploration, but quickly deepened as months of unspoken longing found expression. Dawson's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as Fiona's hands slid up to his shoulders. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Dawson rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "As much as I want to stay, your reputation has already been the subject of gossip," Fiona finished for him, "but you're right." She stepped back, though her hands remained on his arms. "Will you come to breakfast early? We need to assess the barn damage at first light." Dawson nodded, reluctantly releasing her. "I'll be here at dawn." He gathered his still damp boots and headed for the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Fiona, thank you for trusting me with your farm and with your heart." She smiled, a full, radiant smile that transformed her face. "Thank you for being worthy of that trust." The next morning brought clear skies and a new understanding between them. As they worked side by side to repair the barn roof, their shared glances and occasional touches confirmed that the previous night's declarations had not been a dream born of storm and circumstance. Word of their relationship spread quickly through Willow Creek, as such news inevitably does in small towns. Some disapproved, particularly those aligned with Walsh's interests. But many others saw it as a natural development, the lonely young woman and the hard-working newcomer finding solace in each other's company. Mrs. Bennet, after some initial reservation, became an unexpected ally. "Life is too short to deny yourself happiness on account of wagging tongues," she told Fiona after Sunday services one September morning. "My Albert and I married just 6 weeks after meeting, and we've had 40 good years together." As autumn approached, bringing with it the harvest season, Dawson and Fiona's partnership, both personal and professional, continued to flourish. The farm produced modestly that first year, but enough to cover their basic expenses and begin repaying the investments Dawson had made. More importantly, they had laid the groundwork for greater success in the seasons to come. Their happiness, however, was soon tested. On a crisp October morning, Fiona discovered their irrigation ditch had been completely destroyed overnight. The carefully constructed channel collapsed and filled with rocks and debris. The damage was too extensive to be an accident. "Walsh," Dawson said grimly when he saw it. "He's getting desperate." They reported the vandalism to Sheriff Miller, who promised to investigate but warned them that proving Walsh's involvement would be difficult. "He's too smart to do his own dirty work," the sheriff explained, "and his men won't talk for fear of losing their jobs." That evening, as they sat by the fire discussing their options, a rider approached the house. Dawson reached for his rifle but relaxed when he recognized Sheriff Miller's familiar silhouette. "Evening, folks," the sheriff greeted them as he dismounted. "Thought you should know there's been a development with the Walsh situation. Has he confessed to destroying our irrigation system?" Fiona asked without much hope. "Not exactly," Miller replied, "but his financial problems just became public knowledge. Seems those Eastern investors I mentioned pulled out when they heard about the water rights disputes. Walsh's ranch is being foreclosed on by the bank in Carson City." Dawson and Fiona exchanged startled glances. "When did this happen?" Dawson asked. "Papers were served this afternoon." "By this time tomorrow, everyone in the county will know." The sheriff's expression was grim. "That's why I rode out here tonight. A man like Walsh, when cornered, well, I'd feel better if you two weren't alone out here for the next few days. You think he might try something?" Fiona asked, her hand instinctively seeking Dawson's. "I think a man with nothing left to lose is unpredictable," Miller answered carefully. "I've deputized a couple of men to keep an eye on Walsh, but I can't watch him every minute. It might be wise for you both to stay in town until things settle." Dawson shook his head firmly. "We're not abandoning our farm because Walsh can't accept defeat, but we appreciate the warning, Sheriff. We'll be vigilant." After the sheriff departed, promising to check back the following day, Dawson and Fiona discussed their options. In the end, they decided Fiona would stay in the main house while Dawson kept watch from the barn, where he would have a clear view of the approach to the property. "I don't like us being separated," Fiona protested. "It's just for tonight," Dawson assured her. "Once we know Walsh's next move, we can decide how to proceed." The night passed uneventfully, but dawn brought the distant sound of approaching riders. Dawson, who had dozed fitfully in the barn loft, was instantly alert. Through his spyglass, he counted 3 men approaching Walsh in the lead, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands. Moving quickly, Dawson made his way back to the house, entering through the kitchen door where Fiona was already awake and preparing breakfast. "Walsh is coming," he told her, checking his revolver. "With 2 men, I want you to take my rifle and go upstairs. Stay away from the windows, but if anything happens to me, don't hesitate to defend yourself." "I'm not hiding while you face them alone," Fiona argued, her face pale but determined. "Fiona, please, no," she said firmly. "This is my home too. We face this together." There was no time to argue further. The sound of hooves in the yard announced their visitor's arrival. Dawson and Fiona stepped onto the front porch, presenting a united front as Walsh and his men reined to a stop before the house. Walsh looked haggard, his usually immaculate appearance now disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. The 2 men flanking him appeared nervous, shifting in their saddles and exchanging uncertain glances. "Walsh," Dawson acknowledged coolly, his hand resting near his holstered revolver. What brings you to our property? Walsh's laugh was harsh, brittle. Your property, that's rich. You've been here, what, 4 months? 5? I've had my eye on this land for years. Yet it's never been yours, Fiona pointed out. And now, from what we hear, you've lost your own ranch as well. Walsh's face contorted with rage. Because of you. If you'd sold to me when I first offered, none of this would have happened. My investors would have stayed. I would have had the water rights I needed. Your poor business decisions are not our responsibility, Dawson said evenly. Now state your purpose here or leave. For a moment it seemed Walsh might explode into violence. His hand twitched toward his gun and Dawson tensed, ready to push Fiona to safety. But then one of Walsh's men spoke up. Mr. Walsh, this ain't worth getting killed over. The bank's taking everything anyway. Let's just go. The second man nodded in agreement. I got a family to think about. I can't be part of no shooting. Walsh looked from one to the other, betrayal clear in his expression. Then his shoulders sagged, the fight seeming to drain out of him all at once. You too, huh? Everyone's abandoning me. You brought this on yourself, Fiona said, not unkindly. Your ambition blinded you to the damage you were doing to others. Walsh stared at her for a long moment, then at Dawson, and finally at the farm around them, the neat fences, the repaired barn, the flourishing fields ready for harvest. Something like recognition flickered in his eyes. You really love this place, he said, sounding almost bewildered. Both of you. Yes, Dawson confirmed. We do. Walsh nodded slowly, then turned his horse. Come on, boys, nothing for us here, he paused, looking back at Fiona. For what it's worth, Miss Flint, I'm sorry about the ditch. And other things. It wasn't much of an apology, but it was more than Fiona had ever expected from Barton Walsh. She nodded her acknowledgement, and the 3 men rode away, heading back toward town. Fiona and Dawson stood watching until they disappeared from sight, neither quite believing the confrontation had ended so peacefully. Finally, Dawson turned to Fiona, taking both her hands in his. I think the worst is over, he said softly. Thanks to you, Fiona replied, squeezing his hands. If you hadn't come along when you did, helped me when no one else would. I think we helped each other, Dawson corrected gently. You gave me a home when I needed one most. Fiona smiled up at him, love clear in her eyes. And now, what happens now? Dawson took a deep breath, then knelt before her on the porch steps. Now, Fiona Flint, if you're willing, I'd like to make this partnership permanent. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band with a modest pearl. I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Will you marry me? Tears sprang to Fiona's eyes as she nodded enthusiastically. Yes, of course I will. Dawson slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of shared dreams. Their wedding took place that November in Willow Creek's small church, with most of the town in attendance. Even Sheriff Miller abandoned his usual stoic demeanor to offer a heartfelt toast at the modest reception held afterward at the Bennett's home. To Dawson and Fiona Porter, he said, raising his glass, who remind us that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most perfect endings. As winter settled over the valley, the newlyweds found warmth in their shared home and shared purpose. The farm continued to prosper under their joint care, and by the following spring, they were able to hire 2 young men from town as regular help. Walsh, they heard, had left the territory for California. The bank sold his ranch to a cooperative of smaller ranchers who implemented more sustainable grazing practices. Gradually, the tensions that had divided the community began to heal. On the anniversary of the day they met, Dawson surprised Fiona with a small package wrapped in brown paper. What's this? She asked, turning the parcel in her hands. Open it and see, he encouraged with a smile. Inside was a handkerchief pristine white, edged with delicate embroidery and monogrammed with her new initials, FFP. To replace the one I used that day in town, Dawson explained, his voice soft with memory, though I hope you'll never need it for the same reason. Fiona traced the fine stitching with her fingertips, her heart full. That day, when you wiped my face and stood up for me, I never imagined where it would lead. To the best decision of my life, Dawson said, drawing her close. Coming to your aid that day was the beginning of everything good I now have. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the valley in gold and crimson, they stood together on the porch of their home, no longer just Fiona's inheritance or Dawson's investment, but truly theirs together. A home built on mutual respect, shared labor, and a love that had begun with one simple act of kindness in a dusty market square.